She's just a mechanic on the surface, but beneath the grease-stained cover lies a lethal operator known as Specter. When 6 Americans are trapped in a fortified enemy compound, only she can get them out alive. They called me Grease. At forward operating base Granite Point, tucked into the harsh ridges of Khorasan province, that's all I was to them. Just another motor pool sergeant with oil under her nails and a knack for keeping trucks alive past their service dates. No one ever asked more, and I never offered. My cover was flawless. I kept my head down, fixed engines, and blended into the gray dust of the base. To the infantry boys, I was the quiet woman with a socket wrench, my brown hair tied back in a strict bun, my uniform always smelling faintly of diesel. They'd joke, "Grease can make a dead Humvee sing again." I'd just shrug and keep working. But that wasn't my real name. I am Staff Sergeant Mara Cade, 29 years old. And before I settled into wrench duty, I was Ghost Team's embedded operator, running missions no one dared to write down. 8 years of Black Ops, 49 confirmed kills, mastery of CQC, demolitions, and long-range precision work. They used to call me Specter. But after Operation Emberfall collapsed, bad intel, politicians cutting losses, I was burned. Officially transferred to vehicle maintenance after combat fatigue. In reality, I was buried alive in a cover story. Until the phone buzzed. I remember it like it was yesterday. The afternoon was ordinary. The sound of hammers on steel, the drone of generators, my hands deep in a Humvee's timing belt. Then my encrypted device vibrated in my breast pocket. A message flashed. Package compromised. Execute protocol helix. Authorization Sigma 9. My pulse didn't spike. My wrench never slipped. But in my head, the years of silence ended in an instant. Protocol helix was a dead man's switch order, one of the highest shadow directives. It meant Allied assets had been captured and conventional rescue was impossible. One operator, me, was cleared to do whatever it took. I wiped my hands on a rag, set down the wrench, and walked into the comms center. Sergeant Riker, on duty, frowned when I asked for the patrol logs. Why would Motor Pool need that? To see which squads are overdriving transmissions, I lied smoothly. He grumbled, but pulled the files. That's when I saw it. Ranger Recon Team 6 had rolled out at 2,200 hours. Return time was marked 0600. Now overdue by 8 hours. No contact. No heartbeat. In Khorasan province, that meant captured, or worse. I left without another word. Back in my garage, I unlocked the crate hidden under the workbench. Inside was a different life. Tactical gear, suppressed rifles, encrypted comms, and tools not meant for fixing engines. I whispered into the black phone. "Control, this is Specter. Confirm status on package." The voice on the other end was cold steel. "Specter, 6 hostages. Hostile force, 40+. Location gridlocked. No support. No extraction. No record. Do you accept?" I glanced around at the motor pool, the grease stains, the illusion I had built. My cover life. My cage. "Affirmative," I said. And just like that, the mechanic vanished. The hunter woke again. I had 6 hours to change a parts run into an extraction. On paper, I signed out a logistics truck, a tired M1151 listed for a clutch rebuild, and a night delivery to Supply Point Vesper. The convoy manifest read exactly what I'd told Major Harlan. Transmission parts, urgent. He barely glanced at the slip and waved me through. Nobody in command ever reads beyond the line that says routine. That's the magic of being invisible. The truck itself was a project I'd been living with for months. Under the hood, it looked like a mechanic's sweat and prayers, but beneath the outer skin, I'd carved a second life for it. Hidden armor plates bolted behind the cargo wall, a suppressed comm array masked as a radio crate, a concealed rack that would swallow 2 rucks and a sniper system, and a power inverter wired to run night vision rigs independent of the cab. I called it my shop on wheels. It had never failed me in rehearsal. I pulled off to the lee of the base at dusk and started the ritual. The greasy coveralls came off and were replaced with black softshell, quiet-knee boots, and a rig that fit like a second skeleton. I swapped my oil-stained gloves for fingerless tactical ones and tightened the strap on the helmet that would carry thermal and NV optics. Then I unlocked the secret hatch under the bench and fed out the tools I actually planned to use. A compact Remington chassis with a custom suppressor, a Glock with +2 magazines, a pair of shaped charges with remote initiators, and, most importantly, a little black device no one in logistics would ever authorize, a Spectrum jammer disguised as a handheld radio. It would blind the compound's sensors long enough for me to slip inside. The ritual checks were surgical. Magazine in, bolt locked, optics cleared, comms synced to control's dead channel for redundancy. I ran through the old breathing drills, slow in, silent out, until my heart settled into the cadence of someone who had walked through gunfire and come home. The road out of Granite Point was merciless. Ridge lines cut the sky into teeth and switchbacks strangled you with loose rock. I drove like I had every right to be out there, a woman with a parts run. Guards at the checkpoint exchanged bored nods. I paid the toll of a curt, "Good night, Sergeant," and kept rolling. Out past the last posted light, I stopped one last time and slid the license plates to their alternate set. One more thin layer of deniability. After that, there was no turning back. Recon was always the part one loved and hated. There is an intimacy to studying an enemy's sleep patterns, the rhythms of guards, the Doppler hum of generators, the way patrols changed with the moon. I parked 800 meters from the target on a rise and watched through a rifle scope until the compound sharpened in the glass. It was worse than my feed had said. An old quarry refashioned into a fortress, watchtowers ringed with sandbags, searchlights on rails, engineering vehicles bristling with heavy mounts. The enemy had made a home of that place. I picked apart the night in my head. The generator lay in a low basin, fenced with a single lethargic guard on rotation. A blackout there would cripple lights, radios, and thermal cams, enough to buy me a window. The comms hub had its own small tower, and the motor pool was clustered on the south side like a wound waiting to be opened. Their patrols were efficient, but predictable. Four-man circuits, staggered by 42 minutes, and wearing a habit for complacency. There were soft points, maintenance doors, a drainage culvert under the south wall, a blind spot where hill shadow swallowed peripheral vision. I laid the plan like I used to lay charges. Simple, brutal, redundant. Neutralize the generator. Jam their net. Blow a path into the detention block. Get in. Get them out. Leave nothing that would tie back. When the time came, I moved like I ought to have always moved. Quiet, invisible, irreducible. The first sentry never knew I was there until gravity took him. One stiletto strike, a single breath, then I dragged him into the shadow of the generator housing. The fuel line tasted like victory and diesel. I wired the charge with hands that had done this a dozen times. My fingers worked by memory, while my brain stayed 2 steps ahead. The night before the storm, I watched the compound sleep and told myself what I'd always told the dead. Some things are repaired by force. Some things need a final, permanent fix. Then I melted into the dark and waited for the decision to become action. The charges bit into the night like the first teeth of a winter frost. I thumbed the remote and watched the generator die in a single clean heartbeat. Lights guttered across the compound and then went out altogether. Emergency strobes coughed and died a breath later. In the dark, everything became louder. The rustle of frightened men, the clank of boots on concrete, the vehicle radios coughing static and useless curses. Exactly the panic I wanted. I moved fast. The jammer hummed in my pack, a tiny black lie that turned the enemy's coordinated screams into private, useless noise. Without calls to bind them, the guards scattered into smaller, panicked clumps. I flowed through the confusion like oil. One sentry at the motor pool spun toward the sound of steps and never finished his sentence. The rifle's suppressor swallowed the report. He crumpled high and still. I stacked him behind a concrete bollard and kept moving. Detention block was worse than I expected, reinforced, claustrophobic, with barred windows that swallowed light. The 4 men inside were bound and bruised, faces slack with the exhaustion of having been broken and stitched back together by survival. Captain Rowan of Ranger Recon, who I recognized from a video loop years ago, met my eyes and narrowed them into something like recognition. "Took you long enough, Grease," he said, sarcasm like half a grin. "Bad parking," I muttered and handed him a blade. He cut the restraints with fingers that trembled at first, then steadied as adrenaline rejoined the body. We worked quickly. One team member couldn't stand, and the others were wounded enough to need load-bearing protocol. I tore bandages from my kit and patched what I could in the dim glow of my headlamp, keeping an eye on the corridor. We had a narrow window before the compound rebooted radios, or called reinforcements. We never had to fight our way out through the front gate. I'd never intended to. I'd layered exits like escape hatches. A drainage culvert I'd scoped on the satellite pass was barely tall enough for a man to crawl through if he swallowed his pride and exhaled his fear. I crowbarred the maintenance grate and whispered directions. They moved like men remembering how to be aggressive again. One step then another, clutching rifles that had not seen daylight for too long. Outside the walls, the night was a different animal. Figures darted from the shadows, trying to corral the fleeing men. I planted 2 charges on a jeep and timed them to detonate as a diversion, loud, bright, and cruel. Explosions bloomed like false suns, throwing the enemy into disarray. We used their surprise. Rowan cupped his helmet to a radio and shouted coordinates to a phantom extraction that didn't exist, buying us seconds as the militants argued about where the attack had come from. The walk to the truck was a parade of hazards. We hugged ridgelines, slipped through gulches, and moved silent as funerals. Ranger Recon kept their discipline, even wounded. Their training stitched them into a single, efficient body. My truck sat where I'd left it, a dark silhouette against the faint horizon. They stared at the modifications with a kind of stunned gratitude. Caged plates, extra fuel, medical stowage, a spare rack for the sniper that hung like a promise across the cargo bay. As engine light touched my face, one of them, Barnes' second squad, let out a laugh that was half sob. "You really were a mechanic," he said, still unsure how the woman who had replaced brake pads could just remove a fortress from the map. "Mechanics fix what's broken," I said, turning the key. "Sometimes that requires a little demolition." We drove under the same moon that had watched me park there hours before, but I felt smaller inside the cab and larger at the same time. An odd proof that old selves and new responsibilities could share the same bones. Behind us, the compound burned, a dull, terrible orange gnawing at the horizon. The men in the back of my truck murmured thanks and curses, smoke in their throats, exhaustion writing itself into their features. I kept my face neutral. The fewer stories I offered, the longer my cover would buy me. When we rolled back into Granite Point, the medics took them like angels appeared out of nowhere. Fingers that could stitch bone and stop bleeding in ways that paperwork never allowed. Captain Rowan pulled me aside, voice barely more than a breath. "How did you?" "Old job," I said. "Keep them quiet. Get them home." He studied me like someone trying to read the ink under wet paint. "We owe you," he said. "If this gets out." "It won't," I replied. "Not my style." I watched them disappear into the care of the base, and then drove the truck back to the motor pool as if nothing had happened. The grease under my nails looked the same. My chest felt like it carried an extra engine somewhere, one that would probably never be turned off. Later, my encrypted device blinked with a cold, efficient line, "Package delivered. Well done, Specter." I let the message die in the dark and slid back under the hood like a woman returning to her first language. Wrenches, sockets, the predictable heartbeat of metal. Tomorrow the base would hum as usual. Tomorrow someone would ask me where I'd been the night before. I would say, as I always did, that I'd been out on a parts run. They'd nod, convinced, and keep on believing the story that let them sleep. The fortress was closer now. By 2,100 hours, I had worked my way across jagged rock ridges and thorny scrub that clawed at my sleeves. My breath came even, steady. This was where the mask of grease-stained mechanic was shed completely. Here, I was what my record had always said I was, Specter. Through the Remington's scope, the stronghold unfolded in detail. A courtyard ringed by concrete blocks. Guard towers angled for overlapping fields of fire. Trucks with mounted machine guns stationed for enfilade coverage. 40-plus fighters moved with the ease of men who had fought for years. This was no militia rabble. These were hardened veterans. A direct assault would have been suicide. Good thing I had no intention of fighting by their rules. The generator sat downhill from the main walls, guarded by a single man who looked as bored as any sentry ever had. I crawled through the dirt, hugging the blind side. One quick strike, blade through the throat, a hand over the mouth. Silent. Efficient. I dragged him behind the housing before wiring explosives into the fuel line. Phase 1, set the blackout. Next, the perimeter. On the fortress's eastern edge, stone cliffs pressed close, leaving a narrow strip of fencing guarded by 2 militants on lazy patrol. I waited until one turned, then slit his spine with surgical precision. The second turned at the noise, only to find my rifle's suppressor staring him down. One muffled shot. He folded. I was inside. Moving through shadows, I reached the prison block. Reinforced doors. Bars on the windows. I peered through a slit just wide enough to catch sight of the prisoners. 6 Americans, beaten, bound, but alive. My stomach clenched. They weren't just hostages. They were my brothers. I needed chaos to move, so I gave them chaos. Charges placed at 3 critical points: the comms hub, the main tower, and the motor pool stacked with trucks. When those detonated, their neat fortress would turn into a nest of fire and confusion. At 2,330 hours, I pressed the trigger. The generator erupted first. Lights winked out across the compound. A heartbeat later, my explosives tore through the tower and the motor pool. The comms hub went up in a blooming fireball, scattering antennae and men alike. The fortress plunged into chaos. Fighters poured into the yard, shouting in panic. I moved among them like a shadow, optics glowing with their heat signatures while I remained unseen. Suppressed bursts cut down sentries. Sniper fire ripped through machine gun crews. Panic spread fast. Comms jammed, power gone, commander missing. They weren't fighting me anymore. They were fighting ghosts. The prison guards were last. I cleared them with a breach charge through the side wall, the blast shaking dust from the ceiling. Before the smoke cleared, I was inside, rifle barking 3 controlled shots. The hostiles collapsed. Captain Darius Holt, tied to a chair, lifted his bruised face toward me. "Took you long enough, wrench," he muttered with a ragged grin. "Had to find parking," I said, cutting his restraints. His laugh was weak, but real. I armed the SEALs with rifles stripped from the fallen. They were hurt, but far from broken. Holt looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "You did this? Alone?" "Job description changed," I said, handing him a fresh magazine. "We move now." My truck staged north. There wasn't time for questions, only survival. We moved like ghosts under a sky that still smelled of smoke. The SEALs fell into formation as if the fight had never stopped. Stiff shoulders, clipped breaths, eyes that refused to let fear settle. Captain Holt limped but kept pace, his grin gone serious, the kind that says you've seen enough to carry scars on the inside. I watched them as we crested the final ridge and the compound shrank behind us. A bruise of fire, collapsing towers, men shouting orders nobody could follow. My heart kept the same cold rhythm it always did after a job, steady, efficient, refusing sentiment. The path I'd mapped on reconnaissance chewed at our heels. Loose scree, shale that rolled beneath boots like tiny traitors, goat paths that dead-ended in cliffs if you weren't careful. Militants were still organized enough to mount pursuit, but without vehicles they were stuck with the same tired legs as everyone else. We moved low, used the shadows of crags and the cover of a dry ravine. Every so often a flare burned up from the valley and men shouted, but the noise was disorganized, directionless. My little jammer kept their radios useless in bursts, enough to make them shout, not coordinate. When the first contact came, it was close and ugly. 2 fighters burst from a scrub patch and opened up. Barnes, raking fire from the back, slid a limp figure down into a fold of rock. Holt shoved a grenade, and for a heartbeat there was nothing but controlled violence. I laid down suppressive fire, then shifted to cover the rear as they scrambled past me. One of the SEALs, young, blonde, who'd stopped laughing hours ago, caught my eye and mouthed, "How?" I only had time for a half grin. "Mechanics get creative," I mouthed back, and he understood the dark joke. "Don't ask how the wrench kills." We reached the truck in the pre-dawn hush, and it felt, absurdly, like a sanctuary. I'd staged it under a shelf of rock and thorn. The camouflage net had been allowed to gather dust until tonight. They climbed in like men going home, but none of them relaxed. I started the diesel, and its familiar roar felt like an old song. The journey back was a slow, precarious prayer, wool tracks that threatened to slide into a ravine, eyes scanning ridge lines, every shadow a possible problem. I drove with the sort of quiet fury that comes from having your friends in the back and the knowledge their lives now depend on what you can do with a wheel and a map. We rolled into Granite Point as the first pale light bled over the mountains. The medics were ready. Someone had tipped them off with enough anonymity for the crew to prepare tree-off. Hands that had been my enemies an hour before were now steady, efficient, moving with the practiced rhythm of people who make lives out of stitching the dead back together. Watching them work, I felt that familiar split. A calm, surgical part of me that cataloged wounds and a flat, secretive part that measured the cost of silence. Captain Holt pulled me aside as they pushed stretchers into the ward. "I need to know who you are," he said quietly, not demanding, just needing to fit a piece back into his fractured map of the world. I let the raggle of sleep and pain in his face anchor me. "Just a mechanic," I said, the lie tasting of diesel and secrecy. He studied me like he was trying to read a page written in disappearing ink. "You saved us," he said. I shrugged, felt the old reflex to disappear take hold like a warm cloak. Back in the motor pool, I wiped soot from my hands and slid the truck into its spot as if it had returned from a routine run. The oil-scented routine offered camouflage, grease, bolts, a rolling toolkit that would never betray the night. My encrypted line buzzed once, sterile praise and a map of next steps, then died. I bent back over an engine as if I'd never been out of the bay. The world would keep its stories. I'd keep mine. Tomorrow the fleet would need me to make sense of iron and rubber again. Tonight, I had fixed something else. The work of a mechanic was never finished. 3 hours after I pulled into Granite Point with 6 seals alive, I was back in the motor pool. My hands were black with grease, sleeves rolled, eyes down. To anyone walking past, it was just me fixing a coolant leak in a Humvee. That was the cover. That was the mask. Word spread fast, of course. Soldiers talked in hushed tones about the impossible, seals snatched from a fortress in the mountains and brought back alive. No one knew how. Rumors churned. Maybe air support swooped in at the last second, maybe locals betrayed the militants, maybe some new drone weapon had been tested. The truth sat in my pocket, encrypted and silent. At 0800, Major Harris stepped into the garage. "Ramirez," he said, casual, "I heard Bravo team got chewed up last night. Vehicles'll need inspection." "Yes, sir," I answered, not looking up from the wrench in my hand. He gave me a nod and a half-smile. "We'd be crippled without mechanics like you. Keep at it." The irony almost made me laugh. Almost. Later, Captain Holt found me. Still bruised, still limping, but steady. He waited until the others cleared out, then leaned against the bay wall. "You dismantled that stronghold," he said quietly. 40 hostiles. Alone. I wiped grease from my hands and shrugged. Sometimes unusual problems need unusual solutions. That's not much of an answer. It's the only one I've got. He studied me for a long time, then nodded slowly. "Understood. But Elena, thank you. You saved us all." I wanted to tell him I wasn't a hero, that I'd just done what had to be done, but I let him keep his version. Soldiers need their stories. By nightfall, the fortress I'd wrecked was already a ghost, scrubbed from official reports. My name was nowhere near it, and that was fine by me. Ghosts don't belong on paper. 6 months later, a summons came. A black SUV rolled into the motor pool, windows tinted, diplomatic plates gleaming. 2 men in plain clothes stepped out, posture sharp as blades. "Staff Sergeant Ramirez," one of them said, "we need to discuss your recent overtime." I set my wrench down and followed. The secure building they led me to wasn't for mechanics. It was for secrets. Inside sat a panel of military and civilian officials, faces carved from stone. At the head of the table, a woman in a gray suit said, "Your results during Operation Valkyrie have drawn attention at the highest levels of national security." I stood at attention, blank-faced. "Ma'am, I don't know what operation you mean. I've been on maintenance duty for 3 years." "Drop the act, Specter," a voice cut in. "Colonel Harland. My old commander." He slid a folder across the table. Satellite images. Before and after. The fortress burning. Bodies glowing faint on thermal scans. 6 Americans extracted. 0 friendly losses. He looked at me hard. "That ratio breaks every model we have." The woman leaned forward. "Sergeant Ramirez, we don't want to expose your cover. We want to offer you something new." I kept silent, waiting. "A network," she continued. "Operators embedded in non-combat posts. Mechanics, clerks, cooks. Ghosts in plain sight. Activated only when conventional forces can't act." Harland added, "You'll remain invisible. No records. No recognition. Deniable, always. But when the call comes, you fix what's broken. The table was silent, waiting on me. I thought about the fortress, about Holt's face when I cut him free, about the engines I tuned every day, and the enemies I tuned into silence at night. Finally, I said, I accept. Harland closed the folder. Welcome to the most important job you'll never talk about. This country needs mechanics who fix problems no one else can touch. They dismissed me with new protocols, codes, and numbers I'd memorized tonight. When I stepped back into daylight, I felt the weight of it settle in. Not just a soldier, not just a mechanic. Something else now. A ghost in the machine. 2 months later, the first activation came. It was a Thursday morning, quiet as any in the motor pool. I was elbow deep in a Bradley's transmission, sweat rolling down my temple, when my encrypted phone buzzed against my ribs. The vibration was soft, but it felt like a thunderclap in my chest. I wiped my hands on a rag, pulled the device from its pouch, and read the words that would rip the day apart. Package malfunction. Immediate attention required. Coordinates attached. Authorization full. I closed my eyes for half a second, letting the mechanic part of me die off like a switch being thrown. By the time I opened them again, Specter was awake. The coordinates placed the crisis in the Keldron Peninsula, a place claimed by 3 nations yet ruled by none. Smugglers, warlords, and mercenaries fought for scraps of influence there. The Americans stationed at Outpost Daggerfall had been holding a fragile balance, until now. The message gave no details on the hostages, no numbers on the opposition. Just that the situation was unsalvageable by normal means, and that all authority had been granted to me. That was all I needed. Within an hour, I had requisitioned the maintenance truck under the excuse of a supply run. My team never asked questions. They were used to me disappearing into the night for parts. By the time the outpost gates opened, I was no longer in coveralls. My real gear hugged my body, black rig, sidearm snug against my ribs, Remington case hidden in the modified truck. The drive into the peninsula was a gauntlet of half-paved roads and dust storms, punctuated by villages that looked abandoned until you noticed the eyes watching from shuttered windows. I drove steady, like someone with paperwork in her glove box and a wrench behind her seat, nothing more. When I finally pulled into a ridge overlooking the target, dusk was beginning to bleed into night. The site was an old refinery, rusting tanks and towers converted into a fortress. Floodlights scanned the yard, cutting harsh beams through the dust. Armed men patrolled catwalks. I counted at least 30 fighters, but I knew from experience that what I couldn't see was worse. I set up on Overwatch and glassed the compound. Inside one of the tanks, converted into a holding cell, I spotted them. 5 Americans, bound, battered, and ringed by guards too relaxed for their own good. I keyed my jammer, letting it pulse a test burst. The enemy's comms flickered, then died in my headset scan. Perfect. I whispered to myself, a ritual I hadn't broken since Delta days. This is a repair job. Just another repair job. Fix the problem, Specter. Permanently. My plan built itself in layers. Knock out the lights, scatter their trucks, so panic, then extract through the drainage ditch that split the refinery fence. It was a copy of the same strategy that had saved Holt and his team, but every battlefield writes its own complications. As I placed the first charge on a rusting generator, I caught my reflection in a cracked fuel gauge. Not grease-stained Ramirez. Not the quiet mechanic. Not anymore. Specter was here, and someone in that refinery was about to learn what it meant when a mechanic decided to fix a problem with fire. The refinery smelled like rust and hot iron when I slid the first charge into place. Up close, a generator is less poetic and more mechanical. A heart with wires and bolts. An animal you can silence if you know where to press. I taped the timer, double-checked the remote linked to my jammer, and eased back into shadow. My breath was a metronome, slow and trained. There's a moment before the thunder where everything seems smaller, like the world is holding its breath for you to decide whether to break it. I don't romanticize violence. I choreograph it. The sequence was simple: blackout, chaos, breach, extraction. Simple plans are easier to adapt when the unexpected shows up, because the unexpected always does. When the generator went dark, the compound blinked into confusion. Floodlights died like eyelids closing. Men shouted into radios that screamed with static. I watched them scramble through my scope, their muzzle flashes like flares on a stage. My jammer howled again and swallowed their channels. They could not coordinate. They could only react. I moved like a shadow flitting between the skeleton of towers. My suppressed rifle handled the sentries while I crept toward the tank that held the hostages. The smell of diesel and fear braided together. A guard at the door tipped his head, then fell forward with the gentleness of something finally allowed to sleep. I slid the lock with a slim tool and stepped into the stale light. 5 faces lifted when I ducked in, worn, furious, alive. Captain Morales squinted at me and then let out a breath that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Angel," he whispered. "Old nicknames and older ghosts find each other in places like this." There wasn't time for embraces. I cut through bindings with a blade and handed rifles to hands that remembered how to use them. We moved in single file, one wounded hanging on a shoulder, the rest circling like a living shield. Behind us, the refinery began to howl. My secondary charges dented the motor pool and shredded a truck line, turning vehicles into metal tombs their owners would never open again. We crawled along the drainage ditch I'd scoped weeks earlier, water shallow and foul, the concrete slick. Bullets snicked over our heads and thudded into the metal skin of tanks with the ugly sound of missed promises. Twice we had to melt into pits while men with AKs swept the ditch, but the jam kept them from summoning supports fast enough to finish us. At one choke point, a patrol ambushed from a maintenance catwalk. They had elevation, numbers, and the kind of fury that comes from being surprised. I had something they didn't: angle and patience. I dropped one through the throat with a quick knife, took 2 with controlled rifle fire, and shoved a fresh magazine into the man behind me. The SEALs, bloody, breathing hard, moved like a unit again, reclaiming themselves fast. We hit the outer wire at first light. My truck waited 2 clicks north beneath a stand of twisted pines, camo net pulled tight like a secret. I drove like a woman owed nothing, tires chewing through soft mud that tried to swallow our progress and failed. Behind us, the refinery burned and burned, a bright, honest wound on an ugly map. Back at Granite Point, the medics were ready. People who perform miracles with sutures and saline are miracles themselves. I watched them work with a reverence I don't voice. Captain Morales squeezed my shoulder once, brief, grateful, and then gone into the sterile blur of triage. When I rolled the truck back into the motor pool, the engine stilled and the world insisted on normal. I wiped diesel from my palms and set the coveralls back over the rig. There is a surreal calm that follows these nights, an aftertaste of exhaustion and something that passes for peace. The encrypted channel pinged, package delivered. Status green. Specter, off the grid. Control's voice was as neutral as ever. I sat on the hood for a long minute, looking at the sky where dawn leaned into day. The dust clung to my hair like a promise. People said mechanics keep engines alive. Maybe that's true. But sometimes you have to be the wrench that breaks something to make room for repair. I don't expect thanks. I don't expect recognition. Fixing what's broken is its own kind of currency, and in my ledger, the balance keeps me moving. I slid the last rag back into the toolbox and closed it with a soft click. The motor pool smelled of oil, metal, and diesel, familiar and honest. No one would ever know the hours I'd spent threading death and precision across miles of enemy terrain, or how 6 Americans owed the rest of their lives to a parts run. That was the point. Ghosts leave no signatures. The sun climbed higher over Granite Point, washing the base in routine. Soldiers moved past, shouting over engines, hammering, checking radios. I bent over a radiator leak, adjusting a clamp with calm, precise hands. Grease smeared under my nails, as if the night had never happened. And yet, under the hum of generators and the smell of heated metal, I could feel it, the quiet pulse of readiness. A wrench might fix engines, but it could also open doors, topple walls, and thread life back through the broken. Specter never left. She only waited. Hours passed. Reports, logs, and supply requests filled the day. I answered with a nod, a shrug, a faint smile to the young soldiers who still thought I was just grease. I let them believe it. It was easier that way. Then, at dusk, my encrypted phone vibrated again. A message blinked, simple and cold. Package compromised. Execute protocol helix. Authorization Sigma 9. I wiped my hands one last time on the oily rag. The wrench slipped into the corner of my vision, quiet, patient, loyal. I stood, shoulders straight, boots heavy on the concrete. Tomorrow, or tonight, I would be someone else again. I whispered to myself, softly, like a prayer in steel. Time to fix what's broken. And with that, Grease vanished. Specter woke. The night waited, and so did I.